welcome everyone to the November 9th, 2022 meeting of the Riders Advisory Council. I call this meeting to order. John, will you please call the roll?
Sure. Brian Meyer. Present. Mahalia Fernando. Here. Cole Stout.
Here.
Daryl Brewer. Jose Del Cid.
Here.
Mike Leibowitz.
Here.
Marcela Moreno. Pat Sheehan.
Here.
Charmaine Todman Nwanji. Andrew Choi. Emma Wormser.
Here.
Okay, Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you so much. I motion that we approve the agenda as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say no. The agenda is approved. We will now transition to public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to come forward and talk about something that pertains to the work that we're doing or about the WMATA system in general. Are there any members of the public, either in person or virtual, that would like to comment? I recognize Cole.
I think I actually have some positive feedback for the staff and for the board to feed to the board possibly, that as the new maps have rolled out throughout the system, especially on the rail cars, the way they've set them up to make them understandable with what's shut, like the yellow line shut down and the future station, like with the Potomac Yard. I thought it's really easy to understand, and also appreciate the thought to put a sticker on there that says there's no yellow line service. That's just a positive feedback for the board and staff.
Agreed. Are there any other members of the public that would like to make a comment? Hearing or seeing none, we will move into our next item of the agenda, which is going to be a presentation from WMATA staff commenting, or rather presenting about potential service and fare concepts, specifically within the context of our upcoming budget conversation and approval. Everyone has been given the slide deck and hopefully has had some time to review it, but we do have two members from staff who are going to be talking about it. And I think we're going to have a very robust discussion because it's pretty transformative stuff that's being presented. So we have Mark Irvine and Alex Block. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to come talk to us. And I will hand it over to you two.
Thank you. Looking forward to getting into it. So my name is Mark Irvin, Director of the Office of Strategy and Policy, and joined here by Alex Block, a manager who's leading coordination of the service optimization effort. And high level, the purpose of this effort is to bring a fresh perspective to Metro's service and fares. And we've been in a period the last few years where we've probably made more service changes or even fare changes at a faster rate than we've ever made. And the goal now is to take a somewhat longer term and short term at the same time perspective and think what is the best way to run the system for our customers and for the region to make sure Metro is delivering the most value. And so there's a range.
And we're back.
All right. Just to do a quick recap, the rail system we have was designed as a hybrid, taking aspects of regional rail with longer journeys from suburban destinations, along with urban rapid transit with shorter journeys and lots of walking access to stations. And the system sort of resolved those two paradigms of transit by building for very high capacity, high speeds, fully grade separated trains, and lots of planned transfer points throughout the whole network. If you go to the next slide, please. When you look at where people are riding the system today, most people end up using, at some point in their journey, the central part of the system. And that's where we see the segments that have the highest overall ridership. So this is not necessarily where you have the highest ridership stations, but it is reflective of all of the central force of riders converging in the core of the overall system. Go to the next slide, please. We compare that against our overall service frequency. This is looking at our baseline service for the FY 2023 budget. We do see higher frequency in the core of the service, or in the core of the system due to the interlining, but it's not always matching where we have the most customers traveling. So we do have some segments, right now the blue, orange, and silver lines, because of the interlining between Roslyn and Stadium Armory, have our most frequent service. But we have several segments very close to the core, particularly the Yellow Line Bridge and the Southern Green Line, that have relatively lower service, despite their proximity to the central part of the system. If you go to the next slide, please. Part of what we were looking for as part of this optimization exercise was to explore what more frequent service could do. And we think there are two primary benefits. First would be to focus service on those central parts of the network where we are carrying the most customers, but also to offer benefits for riders traveling across the entire network by providing predictable and efficient transfers at some of those pre-planned transfer points that opens up the network to provide access to more destinations. To give an example of what that looks like on the next slide, this is a map demonstrating what a customer boarding at Anacostia Station would see with increased green line service as well as increased yellow and red line service. It's looking at the area, the sort of the bluish and gray blobs are the areas accessible within a 30-minute travel time, combined transit and walking. And by increasing the overall service, this customer in Anacostia would be able to access approximately 25% more jobs in 30 minutes. The key to this accessibility is not just the decreased wait time for the Green Line train, but also a decreased wait time to transfer to the Yellow Line to access places like Pentagon or Pentagon City, and decreased wait times for transfers to the Red Line, which opens up destinations like Noma and others as well. And it's this sort of overall benefit for the entire network, which is the big benefit we're looking to achieve in unlocking the network as a whole. Go to the next slide, please. As we were developing all of these concepts, we wanted to make sure what we were proposing fits with our infrastructure. We have only a few places where we can turn trains. We have several pocket tracks to the system at Grosvenor, Silver Spring, and Mount Vernon Square. We also needed to make sure that all of our concepts used our full fleet, but we are assuming that we have full access to the 7000 series. And with those two constraints in mind, we can deploy more trains in service than our budget baseline from FY 2023.
We do have a question from one of our RAC members, Emma.
Hi, everybody. One question I had was, I know that the goal is to optimize the sort of wait time and keep that as low as possible. But I ride the Green Line every day to work and get off at Gallery Place and experience what I can only describe as sort of the rush of people getting off the Green Line and sprinting to the Red Line because there's oftentimes a train waiting there at the time. Has there been any thought process in this model of actually staggering cars a little bit so that sort of to discourage that sort of panic of people running to catch the train, and maybe building in a little bit of a buffer of a minute or two to allow people time to make the transfer?
This is Mark. I think I'll answer it in two ways. So one is, that is something that is looked at, and we could probably look even further at it in terms of like optimizing the schedules at the transfer point. In general, however, with more frequency, that should be less of an issue, right? There's less penalty for just missing a train there's another train relatively shortly, coming shortly thereafter. So I think, you know, one of the cores of this concept is the idea that, you know, you don't want people maybe taking a long trip, like the first 15, 20 minutes of their trip on one line, and then trying to make a transfer to another line, risking, you know, a 12-minute wait at the transfer point. So that's, you know, we know in general that customers, you know, really disfavor wait time, and there's research that shows it actually feels like it takes longer than time when you're traveling. But your question is a good one. I think that's something we can continue to focus on in terms of the coordination of timing.
If you can go to the next slide. This is just some broader context of how the overall budget impact of any improvements in service might impact the overall budget. And one of the key things we want to note here is that the vast majority of the costs in Metro's operating budget for rail are devoted to the fixed costs of maintaining the system. The actual slice of the pie devoted to service, what we call variable costs, the amount of money that would change with it, either an increase or a decrease in service, is relatively small. And so this gives us the opportunity to make a very significant investment in service at a relatively low marginal cost. If you go to the next slide, please. This just sort of outlines the thought process and how we were sort of organizing some of our thinking, looking at different concepts for each of Metro's 3 trunk lines. For the green and yellow line, we looked at increasing service on the southern segments of both. For the red line service, we wanted to concentrate service in the core and the central part of the system. For the blue, orange, and silver, we looked at improving orange line service and also options to deal with the first and last train times for the new silver line phase 2. And we also looked at some options for changes to Metro's hours of operation. So we'll walk through some of the different concepts for each of the trunk lines. This is summarizing a lot of work that went in behind the scenes, so it's a bit of a high-level overview, but hopefully it'll help give a sense of what we were looking at. If you go to the next slide, please. For the green and yellow line concepts, the main thing we are looking to do with these is to increase the all-day service and peak service on both the green and the yellow lines to as frequently as 5 or 6 minutes per train, or between each train on both lines. And in order to do that efficiently, this would propose having all of the yellow line trains turn at Mount Vernon Square and then continue back south. This is similar to some of the patterns that Metro has operated in the past. This does a couple of things. One, it takes advantage of the Yellow Line Bridge, which is a big underutilized asset in Metro's network. It would increase service on the Southern Green Line, which both serves rapidly growing areas as well as some of our equity emphasis areas. It would provide access to new destinations such as the future Potomac Yard station, and it would maintain the same level of frequency to the areas north of Mount Vernon Square by increasing the overall Green Line service. The big benefit is by, as Mark was mentioning earlier, by increasing the overall frequency and doing so all day, you would reduce the wait time for transfers at both Gallery Place and L'Enfant Plaza for either people transferring from or transferring to the green and yellow lines. If you go to the next slide, the concept for the red line is to, again, bring back an older service pattern by having some trains, about half the trains, turn at either both Grosvenor Strathmore and Silver Spring to both concentrate more service in the core of the system. We looked at this at a number of different levels, whether you could reallocate some of our existing service or increase or decrease the level of service. The main reason to do this is, again, to focus service where we have most riders in the central part of the system, and to reduce the wait times for people transferring to or from red line trains at the key transfer stations. The overall benefit would have some negative impacts for people who live and are riding beyond the turnback stations. It can involve an additional transfer or an additional wait for a train. However, the overall ratio of customers that would benefit versus be negatively impacted is about 4 to 1. the next.
So this, in this concept, it's about the same number of trains on the line, which is by short turning some of them, you're able to have more frequency in the core.
The next slide is one version of many that we looked at for the overall blue, orange, and silver line. This version would involve a slight increase in orange line service. Right now, peak hour orange line trains come every 10 minutes in our baseline. This would lower that to about every 7.5 minutes. Right now, the blue, orange, and silver lines through the core have the highest overall frequency of service. But the main thing we'd be looking to accomplish here would be to try to provide some additional balance on the eastern end between the new Carrollton branch and the downtown Largo branch, where right now, historically, they have had even service, but since the addition of the Silver Line, the downtown Largo branch has had additional service. And there'd be a way to hopefully boost some service to New Carrollton and improve future connections to Amtrak, MARC, and eventually the Purple Line. If we go to the next slide, we also looked at options for the Silver Line. One thing that we started to explore would be what we could do to mitigate the very long runtime from the future Ashburn station when it opens all the way to downtown Largo. We looked at options for some express services, and this could be implemented for a few trains per day, or it could be an all-day kind of service. The main constraints we have with any sort of express would be the only way for us to run the trains faster is to skip stations, and because the system was designed as a two-track system with no passing tracks, the best we can do is to catch up to the train in front of it. And so therefore, the amount of time you could save would be, at best, the gap between the two trains. So we think, this one example shows what a potential service might look like, skipping approximately 7 stations, and it would probably save somewhere around 5 minutes of travel time. Just to put it in perspective, right now, when the Silver Line Phase 2 opens, it'll be about 60 minutes from Metro Center, thereabouts, out to Dulles. So it is quite a long journey. It's by far the longest runtime that we have in the system overall. And I think we'll continue to look at this as the Silver Line Phase 2 opens and we get more data about how people are using the system and the new line. If you go to the next slide, just to get a sense of how some of these different concepts might fit together. Again, we looked at different concepts for each of the different trunk lines, but of course, we want to look at the network as a whole. So this analysis here shows, as Mark was mentioning earlier, a sort of a service neutral reallocation of the red line service along with the increase in both the green and the yellow lines and the orange line. And altogether, that provides a system-wide concept where within the central part of the system, trains would be arriving every 3 to 6 minutes. And across the entire system as a whole, trains would be every 8 to 12 minutes or better all day long. The overall gains, again, thinking back to our goals, we would boost ridership by approximately 4 million rides. We would increase service to equitable areas, and we would make use of a lot of our key metro assets. And the net budget impact for this would be approximately $18 million, compared against an overall Metro Rail operating budget of about $1.3 billion. The most important thing from our perspective also is that this would impact about 62% of the overall riders positively. They would see an increase in service or an improved service against the baseline. There would be some customers impacted. Those are negatively impacted. Those are primarily the riders at the ends of the red line or yellow line travelers from the area north of Mount Vernon Square who would have to to transfer to complete their trip. If you go to the next slide, that is just sort of one potential package of many that we've looked at as we're continuing to evaluate any of these options for potential inclusion in the upcoming FY24 budget. We have all sorts of constraints and considerations we need to take into account. Of course, we'll continue to look at the ridership and cost and equity impacts. We will also have to make sure we have enough rail cars and operators available to run these services. as I mentioned before, these are all predicated on our assumption that the 7,000 series are fully available. They reintroduce some new operations that Metro has done in the past with some of the short turns, but we haven't done in a while. So there's some institutional relearning that will need to take place. But overall, once we have the goal, we can try to ramp up to that level of service. And that is it for the Metro Rail portion of the presentation. So we can pause there and see if there are any questions before we move on to fares.
So I have a quick question. When you looked at the turnbacks on the yellow line, what would you be increasing the frequency on the green line to? Because I know overall you're maintaining that frequency, the existing frequency north of Mount Vernon. So what do you have to increase the frequency on the green line to do that?
Yes, we looked at options that would be as frequent as every 5 to 6 minutes for both the yellow and the green line.
Okay.
So it would match the combined frequency that is approved now for the northern green line when you combine the yellow-green.
Thanks.
I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts about the general, some of the general concepts here. I mean, of course, about the specific concepts, but I think one of the things we found, like when we've talked to people or tried to survey people, is like people have different senses of what counts as frequent. I'm curious if anyone in the room or online, like what do you define as frequent service when you're experiencing it, good or bad?
Well, Pat.
Well, I guess in answering that question, I would say anything a 5-minute wait would be frequent service for me. My question, going back just on one of the points you raised, what are they saying about the Silver Line? I mean, I'm sorry, about the 7,000 series cars now. Are they expecting the entire fleet to be brought in, or I know they've been staggering it for a while? How good is that assumption?
Yeah, so quick answer to that is our COO gave a briefing to the board about a week or so ago about the return to service plan. And there's a phased return where service frequency is going to be, well, we're going to launch the Silver Line and then start improving service frequency in a phased manner starting next month and being up to the full approved service levels by May.
So by May, you expect the 7,000 series to be fully implemented back in the system?
There'll be an increasing number until May, and by May there'll be enough projected to run the fully approved service level. It's approved in the FY23 budget. That's right.
Approved, okay, with the Silver Line in place and running and all. Okay.
And I would also add that part of our goal with this process was to try to look both for options to include in the FY24 budget, but also to look in a longer time horizon as well. So for that reason, we wanted to assume that we had the fleet fully available to us, without knowing exactly when that may be.
Mm-hmm. Oh, last question on this. Wasn't part of the 7,000 series coming back meaning that we were going to take out, what was it, I forget what cars they were, the 50, whatever they were, the oldest cars in the fleet?
So when
Was that? Yeah.
Let me know if this is what you're referring to. So when we received the 7,000 series cars and we got them between 2015 and 2020, it did allow us to retire the original fleet of 1,000 series cars and also the 4,000 and 5,000 series cars.
5,000,
we
yeah,
retired
that's what I was
them
thinking.
early
Okay.
in lieu of rehabbing them. So
But they brought
now we've got 4 fleets. We've got 2,000,
Right.
3,000, 6,000, 7,000.
Oh, okay. All right.
With
I thought it was
8,000
the
on way.
5,000. Yeah, and I thought the 5,000, 8,000 not for a few years, I think. But the 5,000s are gone. So this doesn't, bringing back the 7,000, covering these other areas, also takes into account the cars that you were going to retire. That plan is still good.
Yes, and in fact, like those cars have already been retired.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. I just have two comments, or a comment and a question. I think the service optimization concepts are really interesting, and I think a lot of any concerns I have with them are largely tied also to fare policy related issues, so I'll suspend any comments until later in the presentation to comment on them. Operating hours, I know that was on one of your slide decks. Has there been any specific conversations? I know just longer on Friday and Saturday or earlier on those days. I just didn't know if you had any ideas about what that would look like, or if there's a public preference.
So in general, we've been looking at a number of concepts. You might recall about a year ago, we extended service to 1 a.m. Friday and Saturday. 2 years ago, in the original FY21 budget, there was a proposal in there to extend even later on the weekend until 2 a.m. and that was in fact approved and then suspended at the onset of the pandemic. And so it's definitely something that we're looking at and trying to also look at the balance and the maintenance implications in terms of having enough time overnight to do work. But I think some of the most likely and plausible concepts do focus on the weekend, because right now the way the hours break down is Sunday through Thursday we're closed for 5 hours a night, and Friday and Saturday we're closed for 6 hours. So some of the concepts focus on does it make sense to potentially stay open later on the weekend or open earlier and have a consistent 5 hours of non-revenue time that does trade off with maintenance. So these are kind of things we're trying to work through and figure out.
I'll also say, and I understand that there are budgetary considerations with this, obviously maintenance time, staffing, et cetera. But I think with the opening of phase 2 of the Silver Line to Dulles, I think, ensuring that there's service for early flights, certainly earlier than 7 a.m. On the weekends, I think would be great to consider that. Mike.
Thank you for the presentation. I just had one quick question, hopefully, is do you anticipate any significant, track or station work in the next few fiscal years that will essentially change this or maybe even undercut what we've just talked about today?
And just to ask for clarification, do you mean temporary work that disrupts service, or do you mean longer term things that change the system?
I think something longer term, something where you can see that, maybe in your records or whatever, that in a few years, this station's going to need some significant maintenance. We might need to shut down the station, or excuse me, or a certain area of the track might need something, or a region or an area of the transit zone in the future. Kind of like what happened recently, or if the Yellow Line shut down, or what happened a few years ago with some of the other places.
I think it's a good question, and we do anticipate that there will continue to be, more maintenance and rehabilitation work that does affect service on a short term. Maybe it doesn't always feel short term, short term basis. But in general, I think we're looking at this over a pretty longer time period. What's the best way to run the metro system to benefit the most people, and how does it make sense to run the best service under standard conditions? Knowing that one of the goals when there are disruptions is that we run the best service we can, either around it or through it. So hope that answers your question. I don't think there's anything in particular that we think specifically compromises the concepts.
I guess a follow-up question for particularly thinking about the Silver Line on weekends or certain times of the year. A lot of times in the past, there would be a lot of weekend track work, which caused the weekend on the Silver Line to be essentially useless, where people would have to ride it to, somewhere like in Tyson's and catch a shuttle to take it on somewhere else to get to the core that you were talking about. So understanding that the track is always going to require maintenance, things like that. But is this going to, do you anticipate that being a more kind of a continuing to be a regular cuts, everything you're working for, where if the weekends become inconsistent, particularly on something like the Silver Line?
I think in general, like we expect there will continue to be these like maintenance and rehab needs, but I mean, over the long run, we do want to, so a lot of the work we're doing now is driven by the need to catch up. And we also want to get, better and more efficient at it. So, we are, I think, and personally, very aware of like the customer impact. So, in the longer run, do we hope to lessen it to some degree? Yes. Will it go away entirely? No.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a quick point because I do remember, when I used to live at the end of the Green Line in Greenbelt and commuted all the way to Old Town. I remember that, it turns around at Mount Vernon Square very well, especially because I had to wait for the next bus, and then it extended all the way to Fort Town, and then, I guess just my point would, outside of that, would be as far as like the red line. I know with the slide that you guys had for the orange line, you guys assumed the purple line, but I know it also goes through Montgomery County as well on the red line. Did you guys look at that and how that would impact the red line for like service, and does it need to loop around at Grosvenor, or does it need to just maybe go all the way out to Shady Grove? Just kind of want to get more insights on that.
I don't think we looked at that in detail. However, one of the constraints we had to deal with is that we have a limited number of spots where we can turn trains, where we have the existing pocket tracks. And it just so lines up that the areas that would see more frequent red line service are also the areas that would also be served by the purple line whenever that is completed. So that it's part of the infrastructure that we're working with. But I think, and again, because it's not part of our organization, it's not operational yet, and it's still going to be several years, it wasn't a specific consideration. But in general, I think we do want to, those are the kinds of stations that we expect to see higher ridership and more ridership growth potential in the future.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions on service, we can go through and start on fares. Just a quick overview on fares. This slide outlines the board's adopted fare policy principles that are relatively recent, adopted in October of 2021. The principles are what we use to guide and evaluate any potential fare policy changes. If you go to the next slide, one of the big criticisms we've heard of our existing fare system is that it's very complex. At the same time, in any sort of discussion of this, we are always trying to balance between complexity and simplicity and to make sure that we are still providing an equitable fare system overall. If you go to the next slide, just some more background on our existing fare structure and how fares are calculated. It is rather complicated. We'll start with bus. We have a $2 flat fare across the entire system, with a few exceptions for airport and express services. But for the rail fares, they are all based on distance between the origin and destination stations. However, it is a compound between the distance along the rail system and the straight line distance as the crow flies. We then have separate mileage rates that apply at different breakpoints. For example, you pay the base fare and it'll get you up to 3 miles. And then from 3 to 6 miles, one rate will apply. And then from 6 miles beyond, another rate will apply. Then, of course, we have higher rates during peak periods. And then recently we've added a $2 flat fare for weekends and late nights. So all of that together adds up to a quite complicated system. It makes it difficult for people to understand, but it is something that we've been adding on to for many years. If you go to the next slide, we have just an overview of some of the recent changes that have been made, both on a permanent and a promotional basis in the last 2 years. We've added the free rail to bus transfers, so it's a $2 transfer discount to try to encourage more connections between both the rail and bus systems. As we mentioned before, the weekend $2 flat fares, as well as some lower prices for rail passes and bus passes. In FY23, we extended the $2 fares for late night and also lowered the price point of our unlimited passes. So the break-even price is now set at 32 trips instead of 36. The main thing we would want to note about all of these changes to fares is that oftentimes it takes time for the ridership impacts to reveal themselves. And of course, we were dealing with a lot of additional disruptions due to the pandemic. So we think we've seen some promising results from some of these changes, but again, it will take time to really see the full results. Go to the next slide. Another bit of context looking at the overall budget is that because we have seen a decrease in overall ridership and therefore a decrease in overall fare revenue, any change in that revenue, the same percentage will net less for the overall bottom line. So a 5% increase in pre-pandemic budget situation would generate more revenue than a 5% increase will today. If you go to the next slide, as we look at how we can improve the overall customer experience, it's just important to remember that the actual process of purchasing a fare is just one step along many. There's one touch point along many for the the customer's overall journey. So this certainly gets a lot of attention, and it's a very important part of the overall experience, but it is just one opportunity where we can improve that experience for customers. Go to the next slide to do a brief overview of our goals for this effort. Is that we want to make it simple and convenient, easy for customers to understand how they can determine and then purchase their fares. We want to make sure that race and income are not barriers for anyone to use the system. We want to retain some rough relationship between the value of the service received and the price paid. And then also to make sure that we have a sustainable source of revenue to support Metro's services and operations. If you go to the next slide, this is a sort of a rough summary of the different categories of fare structures that we've evaluated as part of this process. And there's sort of two steps to consider here. The first is the structure of the fares themselves. We have different options there for a fare-free system, a flat fare, zone fares, and then for improvements to the distance-based fare structure. And then in category number 2, there are a whole bunch of other changes to the fare levels that are a bit of a separate conversation from this fare structure. So for any of these structures, we could adjust the fares up or down. You could make some changes. You could apply some system-wide programs, such as a low-income fare product, or other fare elements that do not directly apply to how you use the rail or bus system, such as parking. If you go to the next slide, again, because we have a very complex system, it's useful, I think, to look around the world to see what peer systems do. And this is a summary of some international benchmarking as part of the Community of Metros benchmarking group. And some interesting geographic patterns emerge. In a lot of systems in Asia, they use a distance-based fare. A lot of systems in Europe and in South America, they use flat fares. Zone fares are a little less common, but they do exist sprinkled around the world. And in the United States, we have sort of a grab bag of all of the above. We have some examples of distance-based fares, including our peers in the Bay Area and Seattle, as well as PATCO system in Philadelphia. Go to the next slide to just start to run through some of the concepts. Starting with concept A, which is a fare-free system. This would, as you might expect, grow ridership and lower any income barriers to transit. But the main takeaway from the free fare system is that it may be free to the customers, but it is not free overall. Somebody will have to pay for the overall service, and this would require in FY24 an additional $465 million. Then we would project that subsidy required to grow over time. There are some potential to save on the cost of collecting fares if you were to go with a free fare system, but of course we can only realize that if it is totally eliminated. Another common request is to look at what we have in concept B, which is what would be required for a flat fare system, similar to a lot of the older systems. We looked at 3 different options, looking at what a flat fare would look like on the rail system at $2, $3, and $4. The range of impacts is quite large. $2 flat fare would grow ridership, but would require a large amount of additional subsidy. The higher price points would lose ridership and also require additional subsidy. And all of these have very big equity impacts and considerations that we would need to take into account because it is such a large departure from our current fare system. Depending upon which price point you choose, you would have a lot of existing customers that would either see a very large fare increase or a very large fare savings.
And just to explain the reason it is very hard or essentially impossible to find an equilibrium where you have a revenue neutral, ridership neutral flat fare is we found that people have different sensitivity to price for different trip lengths. So people taking shorter trips, currently paying lower fares, tend to be more sensitive to price than people taking longer trips. And so that's kind of what's playing out in these numbers. Is it's hard to find something that actually balances it out with just this one lever of being able to adjust to one price for everybody.
And then, of course, as we had mentioned before, we're in the middle of the recovery from the pandemic. We're sort of piling assumptions on top of assumptions, and it makes it even harder of an exercise to try to make any sort of projection. So there's a huge range on all of these estimates. If you go to the next slide, concept C is to look at zone fares and replace our current distance-based system with a zone system. The beauty of a zone system is that it is endlessly flexible, and there are so many different ways that you could go about creating zones. We've shown 3 different options here. You could look at the different types of stations. You could look at political jurisdictions and their boundaries, or you could look at a distance-based measuring out from a center point. Then there are all sorts of considerations for how many zones you might choose, whether it's 3, 4, 5, or more, how you would actually charge the fare itself. You could look at the number of boundaries you cross. So if somebody were to go from one side of the region to the other, they may pay, in a 3-zone system, they may pay for crossing 5 zone boundaries, or they may pay for, going from zone 3 to zone 3. As well as different factors for the minimum and maximum fares, regular or discounted rates, what the overall goal for a system would be, whether this would be something we would implement in order to grow revenue or to grow ridership. It's very flexible and could be shaped to meet any number of different policy goals, depending upon what direction the region has for those policy decisions. If you go to the next slide, to try to illustrate this, as again, there are so many different options. What I've selected here is one example of a 5-zone fare system based on distance from Metro Center. So this is each of the different zones is 3 miles of travel based on distance from Metro Center. And the fares would vary based on the number of zone boundaries a trip crosses. So a trip from Shady Grove to Metro Center would cross 4 different boundaries, whereas one going one stop beyond to say Reagan National Airport would cross 5 boundaries, going from Zone 5 into the core and then to Zone 2. There are, with any of these different zones, a lot of trade-offs between the simplicity of the system and the granularity of the system. So the more zones you have, that means the step increase between each zone can be smaller. If you only had a 3-zone system and you retained a similar fare structure that we currently have, where our off-peak base fare starts at $2 and we can go as high as $6. That means every time you cross a zone boundary, you would have to go up $2. So there's lots of trade-offs for how you would go about balancing that simplicity versus the complexity of a system in trying to avoid some of those large price jumps between zones.
Yeah, like Alex is talking about, these border effects tend to be the biggest challenge. Like one concept that we played with that was embedded in one of these examples was to try to deal with that, have a relatively low charge for crossing the first zone boundary to try to reduce, the challenge of, say, someone who's taking a 2-station trip, but just happens to be crossing a border.
And in this case, we used zones based on distance. It's helpful, I think, as a contrast to our current distance-based fare system because it retains a lot of that link between the price paid and the amount of service used, and it avoids some of the potential regional debates about where exactly to draw the boundaries by having this distance-based system. But again, the system could be set up in any number of different ways. If you go to the next slide, we just talk about some of the pros and cons for zone-based fares. Again, there's an opportunity to, even with a complex zone system, to reduce the number of fare combinations and to make it potentially simpler for printing our fare tables and hopefully easier to understand for customers, while still retaining that link between the price paid and the value of the service received. However, it is a major change from our current system, and it would be a challenge both to implement and then to have the customers learn. And as Mark was mentioning, there's an opportunity where some customers on the regular trips could see very large fare increases if they are a relatively short trip just so happens to fall on the break point between 2 different zones. And that could have implications for some of our more price-sensitive customers.
Just in terms of time, I know we want to get to discussion, so we'll try to go pretty quick through the last few slides.
Yeah. If you go to the next slide is options to improve our existing distance-based fares. So there's sort of 2 approaches here. One would be to simplify the existing structure that we have, looking at changes to the mileage rates or rounding to the nearest quarter. All of those could happen, and they could potentially make it a little simpler. Could also eliminate the difference between the peak and off-peak fares. But there's also a number of things we could do to communicate the use of fares with different maps, different pass products, and things of that nature. Potentially also returning to allow negative balances on SmartTrip cards that would hopefully take some of the precision required out of the calculation for customers. If you go to the next slide, again, some pros and cons. These would be very easy for customers to learn, but we still have a lot of the same complexity in our existing system. Let's go to the next slide. I just wanted to offer a brief update on what a low-income fare product might look like. This could be something that would be similar to our existing senior citizen discount, something like a discounted fare for anybody meeting a certain criteria, whatever that threshold might be. It could be also tied to enrollment in an existing assistance program such as Medicaid or SNAP or TANF. This is something that 17 out of the 50 largest transit agencies currently have, and it's something the general manager has expressed interest in, and it is something we are continuing to look into. And then finally, just a quick look at, if you go to the next slide, at some of the other improvements that we are interested in, but we would have to visit in the future for both, mostly for technology reasons. One would be fare capping, which would be sort of automatically applying a maximum daily fare that any customers may pay. This is something that several systems around the world have implemented that would encourage ridership and hopefully promote equity. It's not something we can technically do at this time, but hopefully in the near future. And then also to look at opportunities for regional fare integration, to continue to use both the Smart Trip system and then also any adjustments in fare policy to have a more integrated transit network across different operators, to look at other transit providers as well. And that's it for the concepts on fares, and so happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. We all greatly appreciate that presentation. We'll open it up to questions. I think let's focus, at least this next part, on any questions or areas of clarification. And then once we're done with that, then I recommend that we move to try to consolidate some ideas, potentially for recommendations to the board. Pat?
Thank you very much. Good presentation. I deal a lot with Metro Access fares. I didn't hear that mentioned anywhere with respect to the Metro Access cost of that system. It's generally twice the fixed route fare of bus and rail. I think it was the second to the last slide where you talked about a special fare for for special needs customers. Was that where you? I can't read that because it doesn't read for me through Teams with my screen reader. But can you tell me, were you looking at Metro Access type fares with respect to that, or?
So it's a great question about Metro Access fares. So there's two ways we've been looking at Metro Access fares. As you mentioned, and as you know, they are calculated as a function of like the equivalent fixed route fare, or twice that route with a cap.
Yep.
And so many of these changes, or almost all of these changes, would in some way affect Metro Access fares if we affect the fare structure and how much people pay for different trips. Since Metro Access fares are based on that, they would have an effect. And then the other thing we have been looking at and have actually looked at for the past couple of years is this idea of adjusting the cap on Metro Access fares. And one thing that I think has gotten positive feedback is, with the implementation of these $2 night and weekend fares on the rail system, like you effectively have from like 97% of Metro Access trips, a fixed $4 fare for Metro Access on nights and weekends, and that's about a third of the week. And so I know there's been interest in exploring that further. In terms of
Metro Access fare,
yeah, in terms of the reduced fare program, that is not anticipated to directly affect the Metro Access fare, because right now, even if you say have a senior card, your Metro Access fare is still based on the standard fixed route fare. So it doesn't currently provide an additional discount. But all these other fare changes would impact the fare.
Okay, so I didn't know if that previous second to last slide or whatever covered Metro Access fares as far as what the recommendation would be. But you are looking at a flat fare for Metro Access, and that's good.
Yeah, that's one of the options that was on the list with the board for consideration for FY24.
Good. Thank you.
It wasn't covered in this presentation.
Okay. Well, a lot of good detail in this presentation. Thank you for that. Yeah, appreciate that.
Did you all do an analysis on what eliminating peak fares would do? So you just have one, whether it's our existing, distance-based fare, but without the peak period fares?
So that's a great question. And I was thinking about, this presentation was really long, but there's like even more things that like haven't been covered. So I think that the thinking was to take this in a bit of a sequence and first look at, do we want to make a big move to a like totally different fare structure, like a flat fare or a zone fare? But I think like the key question is like within say like a distance-based fare structure, it really applies to zone 2. Like, do we want to have this different peak or off-peak fare? I mean, be very curious about, comments from you or the group on the trade-offs or considerations there, because that's something we are actively looking at. And as a consequence of the decision the past couple years to adopt this $2 night and weekend fare, which I think customers like and it's been popular, and it has been a simplification, during those periods. It's also, given our system these actual 3 different fare periods, which in some ways makes it more complicated. And it's also shrunk the time when we're charging the off-peak fare, right? It's now only like about a third of the week. It's only in the midday in the week and a portion of the evening before 9:30. So that's definitely something we want to continue to look at.
And one other bit of context on the ridership patterns is that even though we've seen a decrease in the overall number of people, the share of riders using the system at peak hours, we still do see big peaks in both the morning and the afternoon rush hours. So that pattern still exists, even if it's sort of a reduced signal. It hasn't gone away entirely. So we still do have that same pattern that was part of the logic for having the difference in the peak and the off-peak fares.
Now, I might be newer, but when the peak fare started, was there a difference in service levels when there was peak fares? Was there more frequent service on the rail routes? Because now I think Metro seems to be shifting towards consistent, frequent service all day. If I could be wrong there, though.
No, I think that has been, you're right, that has been a shift. I mean, there's still, in the approved budget, the approved service level, there still is more service in the peak, but the ratio is a lot tighter than before, in part because there's a little bit less peak service, but also in part because, the base has been brought up and there's more frequent service in the evening and on Sundays now match Saturdays. So I think that is an important, consideration to the question about peak off-peak fares.
Thank you, and I have a lot of opinions about that conversation, but I'll give it to Jose.
Just wanted a clarification on improving the distance-based fares. One of the things that you guys looked at was having like a negative car balance. Was that something you guys were thinking about for all the 3 zones, or just if you guys were to improve the distance-based fare system? And then I have a second question after that.
That could be a change that the board could adopt that would apply across the board. It is something that would be, it was something that was changed maybe 5 years ago, thereabouts, 4 or 5 years ago. And it could be reversed. So it's an example of something that would hopefully make our existing fares a little more user-friendly and a little easier to use. But yes, it's not specifically tied to that. It could be applied in other scenarios as well.
Okay, and on the zone-based fare, sounds interesting. I don't know how you guys picked the sweet spot with 5. I know you mentioned if you guys did 3, then the price jumps. If you jump from zone 1 to 2. Were there any other type of other breaks that you guys looked at that may be more worth discussion?
That's a good question. Part of the reason, as we mentioned before, that the possible permutations are kind of endless. And so we wanted to have something that was similar enough to our existing distance-based system to have a useful comparison for how it would change things without being just too radically different. And so part of the reason why we looked at this is that, as we mentioned before, looking at our existing fare structure, you for the first 3 miles, you are paying your base fare. And after 3 miles, that's when your distance starts to kick in. And then after 6 miles, the rate changes again. So those sort of 3-mile increments were useful existing breakpoints to try to build off of. So it'd be similar if someone were boarding at Metro Center. Their existing base fare would get them just as far as Zone 1 would in this slide. That's part of the reason why we wanted to go with that. But yes, you could do any number of different options for how it's going. As you can see on the map, 5 zones actually works out pretty well. That gets you up to 12 miles But, the new Silver Line, if we were to continue the pattern, would, add quite a few more zones just for those trips. But, again, there's a number of different ways you could try to work this system, depending upon what the overall policy goals would be.
And someone playing around with a lot of different concepts, and they kept coming up with new ones all the time. Like, look at this, you could do.
And
Yeah.
part of the overall challenge is because there are so many things, we needed to, try to land on something to try to at least start the conversation, because talking in just the abstractions is very difficult, to try to have something tangible as a starting point for the conversation.
Yeah, the only reason why I ask is because like Huntington is in Zone 3, but not Branch Avenue, Greenbelt, Carrollton, even like Vienna. So that's kind of like end of line. So I didn't know if you guys looked at other breaks that kind of like smoothed it out a little bit.
Yes, we did look at those kinds of options. If you go back to maybe the previous slide, there would be ways like on the top row, looking at the station typologies. This had one, or it's basically stations in the very core of the system, then stations in the inner jurisdiction, stations inside the Beltway, stations outside of the Beltway. There's a number of different ways you could slice and dice. I think the experience of staff has been that when you use some of those other, ways to draw the lines, that quickly becomes an exercise of, well, why did you draw the line here as opposed to there? And that's one of the useful things about having the distance from a center point, is that that's a good way to sort of start the conversation and illustrate some of the trade-offs involved. But yes, you could easily draw these zones in any number of different ways.
Yeah, and just an example, right? Not all of our trips follow a straight line through the zone. So we got feedback from somebody in Arlington actually about the way that the lines go from like Pentagon City to Rosslyn and then to Courthouse. It kind of goes in and then back out. So you're actually crossing two zone boundaries to make a trip that's within the same zone, and you're kind of getting charged for three zones. So in some sense, there's, I'm sure, opportunities to further tweak and optimize this kind of thing. But like Alex is saying, there's also some sense where there's inevitably going to be, some issue, no matter where you draw the line.
No, I just appreciate you guys explaining that, because like just looking at the image, it's just like, okay, maybe we're set on 5, but there was a lot more thought to this.
Yeah, this is an attempt at a best version of a reasonable concept, but by no means necessarily the best or the only.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was looking, have you looked at the experiences of other cities that have zone fares? Because a couple of years ago, I was in London and went to Heathrow Airport, and they had zones, and I looked at the map. I didn't know where I was going, but they had a tourist pass, so I ended up buying the tourist pass, so I didn't have to figure out the zone. So I just wondered if you had looked at other people, other cities' experiences with zones.
Yeah, that's a great question. We have looked at some of that. If you could go back to the slide, a couple with the map. It's a few back, yeah. This is a great sort of summary of how, and I was a little bit surprised when I saw it the first time, how relatively rare the zone fares are, but London is one of the really prominent examples. And they, of course, have a very extensive transit network that covers multiple modes. But all, for the most part, unified under one governance structure, which I think is part of their the benefits that they have there. But at the same time, as you mentioned, their system is so large that it still has a lot of the complexity that we have heard as a criticism of our existing fare structure, and have adopted other methods such as fare capping as ways to deal with that complexity and simplify it for users, particularly infrequent users such as tourists. The one example on this chart that I am aware of is, I believe it is, was it Seattle or maybe it's Vancouver, who currently has a zone-based fare system but is moving to a distance-based fare system. We're not aware of anybody else who's going in the opposite direction from the distance-based to a zone system. But there are a few examples of a zone system and then abandoning that in favor of a distance-based system.
Are there any more questions? Hearing or seeing none, thank you very much. Mark and Alex, you're more than welcome to stay for this next part of the discussion because certainly you'll probably hear a lot of this feedback either at the next board meeting or, you know, maybe if it helps inform the decision-making process behind what General Manager Clark ends up proposing next month, then that sounds good to us. But for the rest of the RAC, I think as it pertains to the fare optimization and the service optimization, I highly recommend that we have a discussion about some potential items that we can agree on, or at least bring to the board so they can consider it and address it for the FY24 budget. To the extent that any of these end up becoming part of the FY24 budget, either, you know, during the initial proposal phase or what's ultimately agreed upon, has a very extensive public process of which we're part of that. But I do think that there's no harm in us at least initiating some of that discussion with the board before they ultimately approve it. And even if that means us going to the next board meeting and talking about it before General Manager Clark has ultimately revealed the FY24 budget. So if there's any comments or recommendations on what you all have just heard and seen, we're all ears. I'll start. I think there's some temptation to make a big splash, right, in order to be as transformational as possible. And I get that, but I do think incremental change is still incredibly useful and has a huge impact on the day-to-day lives of the riders. And I know a lot of the people that I've been talking to, some of the incremental changes that were made for FY23, and that some of them were implemented last year for FY22, like the $2 weekend fares, the $2 fares after 9:30, the bus to rail transfer, were generally regarded as great ideas and had a lot of public buy-in. So personally for me, I think the fare structure on, what is it, slide 29, I think those that are in the D, the improved distance-based fares, as well as the fare pricing, personally for me is I think where we should be looking at in terms of transitioning the fare structure of the system, and not necessarily the zone-based fares, the flat fare, or a fare-free system. And I think part of that, just my personal recommendation, is to get rid of peak and non-peak service. I honestly think part of that ratio of service tightening over the course of the day is a good reason to do so. I think if we decide to move towards service optimization on the red line, where you're going to have less service between North Bethesda and Shady Grove and Forest Glen and Glenmont, or on the green line potentially north of Mount Vernon, I think charging people for peak fares during those times is not right. And yeah, and you know, yes, people that ride Metro Rail are less price sensitive, but I think the peak versus non-peak is more of a fairness issue for a lot of people that ride it. So I think eliminating that, I think, would be a good idea in my personal opinion.
Brian, it'd be interesting to hear the rest of the RAC, and if you're all aligned on that, or various as you think about coming forward to the board. So yeah, maybe a conversation around what Brian just presented.
Brian, this is Pat. I would also agree with you. I think that you will get it took us what 2, 3 years to get rid of the turnbacks, and particularly on the Red Line, Silver Spring and Shady Grove, and people were pleased with extending the system all that way. Putting the turnbacks in, taking things away from people, I don't think is going to encourage people to use the system. I think also the 5 zones, and I don't remember the 4 principles because I think that kind of violates what we were looking at, simplification, and the increased zone-based fares go against that quite a bit. I've heard more of a flat fare system. I think we can make arguments for that with respect to equity and fare simplification, particularly if that can be used to sustain the system. I think you always have to look at simplification and sustainability. Some of these the fare policy optimization, and then also the structure optimization are too radical, and they make too many changes to a system where we're trying to attract people back. And I think by overcomplicating the system, you're going to make people turn away from it. So your suggestions I agree with, and if I'm pushing for something, I would try to get a flat fare as much as you possibly can for the system, and simplify it, and then argue that in terms of equity.
I think with option B with the flat fare or something, we should see where we can go with that. I mean, the things that were proposed with the improved distance-based fares, I think that they're the right directions, like the negative balance, but it's just too complicated for folks coming into the city. We're trying to attract folks, and if there's like tourist pass and stuff like that, great. But I mean, I think it's to the point where we should probably try doing something a little bit more, not radical, but a little bit more, fair, and just knowing how much it's going to cost you going in and out of the system. It doesn't matter where you come in.
Emma?
So just a quick comment for me, and maybe this is sort of selfish in my perspective, but I guess I want to look for things that make it easier for the people who live here, and maybe tax out-of-towners a little bit more. So when I think about like peak fares, I think about that's really harming people who use the system on the regular, since those are the people traveling during rush hour, whereas tourists are going to travel more throughout the day. So I would advocate to not really have those peak fares and sort of make it advantageous to the people who are using it on a daily basis.
I agree. I am not a fan of the peak and off-peak fares. I do find the flat fare pretty attractive, just because of simplicity. You know how much you're going to pay. It does make it a bit more, I guess, fair to people moving into the zones if it's just a short trip. I do have a question on the fare capping. You said it's something that you're looking at in the future. Like, how far in the future? And did you figure out like a number for that? Or I guess how far in the process of fare capping have you gotten?
Yeah, well, I wish I could tell you like a few weeks or months, but it's going to be, it's something that is going to be a capability of our new back-end fare system that's currently in development and will take a few years to implement. Because right now our current fare system can't implement a fare cap. So we are going to have the capability to do it in the future, and then that's when we would figure out all the policy decisions. Like if we had a fare cap, would it be a daily cap, and how much would it be, or a weekly cap, or a monthly, or some combination. But that's been, I think, popular where it's been implemented, places like London, Portland, and others.
Mike?
I totally agree with everybody who's saying that the peak fares should hopefully go away. It's confusing. I think it's just unfair for a lot of things, everything that everybody else already said. I'm inclined to think that the flat fare might be the best. I think in some ways simple is good if you can find a number that works, with the budget and everything like that. And also I think the flat fare idea is good because I think it encourages riders from all parts of the system. We riders to go like 60 minutes or more from one place to Metro Center, and you want to encourage them to do that because you want to take away the disincentive, because you want to drive. There's always the thing: do you want to drive if you can drive, or do you want to take the Metro? And flat fee that's on par with everybody else is like, okay, you're welcome to take this. You're going to be even with everybody else. So that's just my thoughts on that.
Add another one to the list of getting rid of peak fares. I just don't think it's, with the service levels, like you said, Brian, the base coming up, it doesn't make sense. I think Metro should be putting, just from a service perspective, is if you have a lot of riders during peak time, like it's your duty to put a few more trains on the line. And as we talked about, like the cost to operate that additional service is pretty negligible when you talk about the effects to the whole system. I think I lean towards improving the distance-based fares, whether that's rounding to the nearest quarter or thinking about other ways to simplify it. I'm not really sure, but listening to people talk about the flat fare, I think that also does make some sense. I think it would provide some more flexibility for people who do not have a car, don't want to get a car, can't drive. It makes them be able to find potentially more affordable housing options further from the city center, while not having to increase their transportation costs to get, well, if it's their job work in the city or on the other side of the metro area, they have more accessible and affordable options to get across the city. I know that has significant budget implications, and I think that is discussion for the board, not for us to make, because it has a lot of jurisdictional impacts on how we fund the system. In terms of the turnbacks, I think when I first moved here, the green line, so I would have to, take the yellow line across and have to make that transfer at Mount Vernon, and there was just not enough green line service. I think I'd be certainly more open to it if the green line did have that reliable, emphasis on reliable, less than like 5 minute, every 5 minutes to continue that trip. Because there was nothing worse than getting off at Mount Vernon and seeing 10 minutes to the next green line train. I think a lot more riders would be more open to having that transfer at Mount Vernon if you have a train coming in 5 minutes or less, which it sounds like that was kind of in the conception.
Yes, but I do have a question, and I know that this is, I know I had the opportunity to ask this question, but I just want some clarification in terms of the distance-based fares, in terms of how you determine, you take the distance between two stations as a straight line, and you average that with the distance it would take to ride the rail there?
That's correct, and
like a 50-50, right? So they're equal.
Exactly, and I will say that in general, that is in the customer's favor compared to just taking the track mileage. Right. So if you just, right now it's 50-50. If you switch it to based on track mileage but kept everything else the same, the fares would be higher. If you switch it to as the crows flies, everything else the same, they'd be lower overall.
Are there other formulas that can come to your mind that you think would make more sense? This is assuming that we keep distance-based fares. Is there a different formula that you all have either toyed with or that you think the public would make more sense out of?
To some degree, it's similar in terms of the wide range of options with the zone discussion, because there's a few levers you have at your disposal, right? There's what is the minimum fare, what is the maximum fare, how much do you charge per mile? So there are definitely options we're already looking at or could develop that do, compress the peak off peak, or somehow consolidate so you have one fare all day. The range of possibilities is very, very wide. You could have something that kind of lowers down to the off-peak level, raises up to the off-peak level, splits the difference, or has similar minimum max fares and different mileage charges. There's a lot of possibilities. It's possible to find some that are, about revenue ridership neutral compared to where we are now. One note, though, even if it's ridership revenue neutral overall, there's just inherently going to be different effects on different people. Because if you're going from 2 tiers to 1, some people are going to kind of experience maybe a decrease, some more of an increase. There's ways to bound that, but always going to be a little complicated.
I only say that because I haven't decided on whether a flat fare or a distance-based fare is preferable, but I do think if I side on a distance-based fare being something that's right for our system, maybe looking at that formula and seeing whether it's the best formula in terms of meeting our fare policy principles as a system.
Yeah, I will say one thing we have noticed in the benchmarking is having a distance-based fare is generally like pretty common among metros in the world. Charging a different peak off-peak is actually a bit less common. Like of those systems all around the world, something like 5 of them have peak off-peak difference, whereas distance-based is actually very common. It's almost a plurality of the systems.
Yeah, cool.
I guess kind of still sitting on that fence between the distance-based. I think with the hybrid system that we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation of how the system was designed as a mix of a commuter and like rapid transit system. I kind of think that for that, you have in the inner core, you have your kind of almost have a base fare. If you're traveling in the inner core, you're paying somewhere like around that $2 to $25 range. And if you're going further out into the suburbs, you're paying more like what you would pay for a commuter rail train if you were taking comparable to like a MARC or something, or a New Jersey Transit up in like the New York metro area. So I think the distance-based fare works for that to kind of bring some parity to the hybrid system. But like I said, I'm debating myself about the flat fare and expanding options for folks around the region.
And along that same conversation is, I've very limited scope in terms of who I engage with and who I talk to, but people don't like distance-based fare because it costs them more money, not because they find it unfair, right? And I think, and in terms of the cost, well, Metro Rail is less price sensitive, and there's a lower percentage of those individuals that are low income riding the rail. But that's also why there are some proposals like having a low-income fare product or a program in place. And trust me, I budget how much I pay for my fare every single month, just like everyone else does. I don't want to have to pay more than 1 penny than I have to. But we also need to think about the financial solvency of the system. Are there any other comments? Yes, Brianna.
So Brian, I have a question. Are you all, as a GRAC, if you're planning to bring something back to the board, do you want to build some consensus around that? Are you bringing kind of a mix of opinions around that? You don't have to have consensus. You could have a vote where there's a split vote on different things, but if someone has a proposal on the table that you would want to take to the board, this would be the time to do that. So I think, John, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so it can go a couple ways. It sounds like there's a fair amount of consensus, at least from what I've been writing down, is there's a fair amount of consensus around simplification in terms of fares, right, of whatever form that takes, be it a common thing I've heard is eliminating the differential between peak and off-peak fares, looking at options to simplify the distance-based fare or eliminate it entirely within those constraints. And so those are sort of the three bullet points that I would bring to the board. What I think I'm hearing, or maybe what I think I didn't hear, is anyone noting a big benefit, or that, I'm sorry, that a zone-based fare system would fit into that consensus sort of around simplification? Is that am I characterizing this fairly?
I'll let anyone speak about that, but zone-based fare is not anything that I right now would recommend. But yes, generally what you paraphrased is a correct assessment, I think, of the desires of the board, and I'd be more than happy for us to vote on a couple of them. And I do think that the flat fare versus the distance-based fare, but with significant modification in terms of the formula, they're two very different proposals, but if we're divided as a council on it, then we can just let the board know that we're divided. I think that's fine.
Yeah, I would say at this point, in terms of the schedule of the board's budget development, if you can give them some concepts, we'd like to see fares that are simpler. We'd like, it seems like there's some okayness, well, it's not a great word, but people are okay with distance-based fares in terms of like how they relate to the service that people are getting. Those are the concepts the board should look at as they put together budget recommendations. And then folks are okay with the proposed service enhancements as long as none of the options leave people too high or dry.
Well, and I think I know a lot of the discussion that we've had over the past 20 minutes has largely been focused on fare optimization, but if there's any comments about the service optimization portion, please let us know. For one, and this is obviously, this is not going to be too controversial, but I think having the system opening later and earlier, having longer operating hours and again, I know there's budgetary and I don't need to talk about all the complications that arise from that proposal, but I do think having a system that operates longer just is a kind of a tide that rises all ships.
I agree with you on that, Brian. This is Pat. I think one of the other on the service optimization piece, the turnbacks, I think, are going to be a real problem. I think that would turn people off and get people angry. At a point where you are trying to build goodwill and have people return to the system, you don't need that. I don't think the return on investment's good, but I'm sure you have numbers. I'm just sort of arguing from a gut reaction. I think, John, what you said with respect to the zones, multiple zones, goes against the fare simplification policy that we're arguing. So I don't see how you can say this is one of our core principles and then propose a zone-based system that's going to go against it. I think if you argue for a fixed fare, you've got to also argue that it has to be sustainable within the system. You can, and Brian, you've said that you can't build a system or propose a fare structure that's not going to allow the system to be sustainable. We don't want to bankrupt the system. And then the other areas that were based on a bunch of assumptions. The 7000 series. What happens if that doesn't come back like we think it's going to? How is that going to impact some of these decisions, discussions, and all? And then the time between trains, 5 minutes is something that's doable. We've talked about waiting for another train for another 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I think that doesn't induce people to want to use the system. So I think there are some things like that that we need to look at. But good range of subjects to think about and talk about. But I'm all for simplification. We've also talked about equity, and so you can make those arguments in terms of equity also, but not, I don't think, with the zone-based system.
Sounds good. Jose?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what John kind of summarized, just whether it's flat fare or improving distant base, it just needs to be simple. And on the service optimization, if we're going to go back to the turnbacks, we should go back to the late night as well. So, you know, I understand the maintenance that is also needed as well. So I don't know if we need to just come to consensus or Brian, what would you advise?
We don't necessarily need to come to consensus in terms of, it would help, certainly, I think, writing the report and presenting it to the board and, talking to them about it, but I think they understand that we represent very different constituencies, riding habits across the system, and that would be the case. I do have one point of clarification. The turnbacks, would that be over the course of the entire operating day or only during certain periods?
Yeah, so the turnbacks would apply all day. So in general, these concepts are about all-day frequent service with a little bit higher frequency in the peak, but also higher frequency all day. And I think I want to make an important distinction between the red line concept and the green and yellow line concept. The red line concept does use turnbacks to reallocate service. So it means that the ends of the line would have less frequent service than in the baseline, and the core would have more frequent service. The green and yellow concept is different than that. The green and yellow concept is about upgrading the frequency on the southern yellow line and the southern green line to match what the northern green line currently gets. So the northern green line is budgeted for service every 5 to 6 minutes, whereas the yellow line, southern green line get 10 to 12 minute service. And so this is actually about using the yellow line turnback to equalize the service on the 3 parts of the line. If you think of it like a wishbone, like right now, the combined part gets twice as much as the bottom part, and this would use the yellow line turnback in a way that essentially equalizes it. So this is about essentially leveling up, whereas the red line is about reallocating.
Mike?
Just want to reiterate after what John was talking about, that simple, again, is good. Going back to my favorite topic of the Silver Line, I think the GM said a few meetings ago that 12-minute wait times is budgeted for the Silver Line kind of phase 1 and phase 2 areas of it. And I just think that if you're going to have the 12 minutes, which is going to be probably the highest on the system, I imagine, and then you have this kind of a higher price if they want to go that way. It seems like it's not encouraging people to take the system or to use the system from the Silver Line. And I think if you go it from that point of view, then you actually can experience less ridership, which means less money for Metro if you're going to do it that way. And just one other thing that it looks like nobody's talking about when we talk about peak fares, particularly if we're going to put it in writing or recommendation, I think most of us kind of don't like it, is that no one's talking about kind of the history. And granted, things have been pretty good, knock on wood, these last few months, but no one's talking about kind of the meltdowns or the significant service disruptions where riders have balked at paying peak fares. And I think that's something that, if we're going to represent, the riders' interests and their thoughts, that's something that should be kind of included if we're going to discuss peak fares. And it should be part of the calculus as we discuss fares and how that goes. And I think by getting rid of the peak fares, that somewhat gets rid of in the future if something weird happens where, people aren't feeling like they're getting ripped off for however long a service disruption lasts.
Thank you. Any last comments before we move on to solidifying and finalizing our recommendations? Yes.
I just wanted to comment on the history of the turnbacks on the red line. As I can remember it years ago, the citizens of Montgomery County in the inner suburbs, of Shady Grove versus Bethesda, the county said they wanted the same level of service. So what they did was that they just went in their budget and paid for to have the same level of service and eliminate the turnbacks at Silver Spring and Grosvenor. So what happens if, would that be another proposal that if you want different levels, the jurisdiction would pay for it like they did before?
Thanks for the question. I mean, as you note, like we have had pilots that were structured that way. I think this one you're talking about was sometime in the 2000s when there was a funded pilot to do that. We've certainly done a lot of that on the bus side, where specific jurisdictions sponsor specific service initiatives. It's been less common in the rail system in recent years, but I mean, it's something we could, of course, look into.
Anyone else? Okay. I know it's not necessary. I think John and myself do a pretty good job synthesizing the position of the RAC on any given month, but I do think because we're providing concrete recommendations to the board, I think we should at least get on the record people's support or opposition to what we're proposing. So in terms of our board recommendation, I think one of them should be to just completely eliminate peak versus non-peak fares. Is there a second?
Jose, second.
Second.
There's a second. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? That passes. I think one of the things that we should include in a recommendation is, I think, further exploration of a flat fare program, specifically what price point that flat fare would be and the financial viability of it. And if not a flat fare, at least a minimum explore formula changes if we're going to keep distance-based fares. I know that's not a very concise resolution, but I think
second
kinda
that one,
sums up.
Brian.
There's a second. Thank you, Pat.
Why don't you say it again?
Yeah, so explore the flat fare system further, specifically the financial viability of it and what the flat fare would be. Or at a minimum,
And by financial viability, Brian, you're meaning sustainable for the system,
correct.
Right. Okay.
Or at
Yeah.
a minimum, explore formula changes for the distance-based system.
Agree with that.
I think we can kind of put both of those in front of General Manager Clark and the board to handle. There's a second. All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, please say no, nay. Okay, that passes. I would also propose, that we recommend a low-income fare system or product. I don't think we need to get into details about how that would be implemented. I think we could just leave that up to WMATA staff, but I think the general concept of a low-income fare system, I think is appropriate, and I think we should recommend that.
What would that cover people with disabilities, Brian, do you think, as a group, or no? Or just low income?
I don't know.
I don't either. I mean, in some way, and Mark, you feel free to jump in as well. I mean, I think in some ways it would recognize the fact that many individuals with the sort of Venn diagram overlap of individuals with disabilities and individuals who are low income is probably a greater overlap than that of the general population. And then I'm not sure, we also have our existing senior citizen and disability fares, which are not proposed to change.
Yeah, I mean, one version of a low-income fare concept is you basically take the existing, senior disabled fare, which is half off most of the time, and you just expand qualification for that. So there are going to be additional ways to qualify, like if you're enrolled in SNAP with an EBT card or Medicaid, you could also qualify to get an equivalent discount. There's other ways to do it too. And we could get more details on how the disability qualification works for the existing fare, but that is something that exists now. And
Right.
you can-
Okay.
you can get a
I'm
discount.
good with, yeah.
Are
I
there
don't want
not-
to overcomplicate it, yeah.
I know we're talking about rail, but is there not a reduced fare for people with Medicaid and Medicare cards currently? Medicaid and Medicare?
Medicare, not Medicaid.
Got it.
So
Okay,
one of the
Medicare
main
for older
low-income fare concepts
adults, Medicaid for poor people.
is to expand it to include these means-tested programs like Medicaid.
So I think just trying to encapsulate everything that was said is a low-income fare product that tries to encompass as many groups as possible, including those in the accessibility community. Is there a second?
Second on that, Brian.
All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, please say nay. That passes. I would also vote that we increase our operating hours. I think this is, I don't want to get into which specific hours. I don't think we have enough data to back up whether we should open up on Saturdays an hour early or on Fridays an hour and a half late and what that means for service. But I do think putting that in front of the board that there is public support behind expanding operating hours is important. Cole, you're about to say something?
I was going to say, especially, I think late night on weekend service is really important because getting home after the rail closes, I think there's still a lot of people who move throughout the community who have to rely on rideshare, and those can be very expensive and lead people to make decisions that are not safe for themselves or others. So
Like the retail industry, we've seen that before.
Yeah.
Right.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed? We'll include that in our recommendation. And I don't know if I have any opinions in terms of the turnbacks in the service optimization that we see on like the red line. I don't know if anyone has a resolution that they'd like to propose for that, or if we can just say that we had a robust discussion and that there were some on the rack in favor or against it.
I don't know if I heard anyone in support of a red line turnback. I think I was the only one that maybe supported a yellow line turnback, unless some folks had the same opinions, but just didn't voice them.
I think for me, it's just, they had to explain it a little bit more. I'm just used to what it was before, so that stigma kind of stayed. So I'm okay if we move forward with it or not. So.
Are we interested in having more data on the turnbacks, perhaps come back to the rack at a future date? Or more information on some of the service optimization? That was a more technical discussion, I thought.
I agree. I think the service optimization debate tends to be a little more complicated. And I have a lot of opinions about it, but I don't even know where to start in terms of coalescing or trying to write a recommendation for it.
So can I just again put forward that I don't know that we're at the point of recommendations, because I think at this point it would be helpful for the board to carry this forward and take it out to the public and look at it more, or nope, stop, don't waste any more time on this, right? Or don't spend any more time on this. It wasn't a waste, but don't spend any more time on this. We have heard what we need to know, and thanks, but no thanks, right? So I don't know that, so I think you can say, hey, explore this more, do outreach on it, hear what people think, get a little bit more data, we'll come back to it. If that's something you're comfortable with, I think that would be something to tell the board this month, and then let it play out.
I think that's, as it pertains to the service optimization, I think something.
I
we
think
should
I'd
include
rather
in our
get more
recommendation.
data.
Yeah.
More data, Brian. Yeah, I agree.
So what John said as it pertains to the service optimization proposals, all in favor?
Aye.
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 All opposed? Okay. Are there any more resolutions or discussions that someone would like to lay on the table?
Just like the ones that we've agreed on, John, if we could send them out to everybody so that that we can take a look at them if we want to speak to them at the board meeting, that would be great.
Sure. So the board meets a week from tomorrow. My goal will be to get a draft report out to you, hopefully by close of business tomorrow, so that you all can look at it and over the weekend, and then get it back to report to the board next week.
Anything else?
And
Oh, sorry.
just to clarify, sort of overarching big picture, what the board will be doing either next month or in January is approving taking proposals out to the public. So is what I'm saying in this report, we think you should move forward with taking these out to the public and getting them down the road, or are you at the point of, we think you should do these things?
I think yes and yes. So I think part of it is because General Manager Clark is going to propose his FY24 budget, and if some of these things are or are not in it, then we can just say that we maintain that the board should still consider it. If they are, then keep them. Yeah.
Okay. I'll play around with the language and,
Yeah.
and
I
hopefully
think
get something
that
that's acceptable.
due diligence of the board is that they would want to go out and get feedback, but I think coming from, it'll be interesting for us to say this is what we think, and it'll be interesting to see the word back from the public if they agree with the RAC. I think that'd be kind of interesting. I think we're on target, but I'm not afraid of them coming back and saying the public says thumbs up or thumbs down on the same thing the RAC says.
Okay. I will, no, I just want to make sure I capture, like, I don't want to put you guys, I just want to make sure that I get your position accurate in what I'm reporting to the board.
Especially because these comments are going to hit the ears of General Manager Clark and the members of the board of directors before an FY24 budget is public.
Right.
So none of this is intended to complicate that effort. I think it's just intended to represent our views. And if we need to repivot in December, most likely in January or February, about what we recommend or what we think needs to be changed for the FY24 budget, then I think we just repivot at that time.
Okay. I've been in this business long enough that I can give you guys an out as part of of how I phrase it.
John
Well,
will help save us.
I think, if I understand it, I mean, you're bringing your thoughts to the board based on what is in front of you right now. And what's in front of you 2 months from now will be different. And so I think it's a point in time set of proposals and recommendations for the board to consider as they evolve on these parallel paths.
And Brian, if you haven't, reserved the word repivot, I think I might use that in another set of arguments I might make sometime. I like that word.
That's fair. I was also trying to remember what Brian had just said, because I may ask you to rewrite that down. Are there any more discussions about the fare and service optimization presentation and conversations for our report?
it's not about your report, but I just want to, I want to thank Alex and Mark for being here and the staff in the back. But I really want to thank the RAC for such and John and Jose as well. But I really want to thank the RAC for a really thoughtful conversation. I mean, really, it's fun to really see you guys roll up your sleeves and bring passion, insight, experience from all across our DMV to this conversation. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. So.
Agreed. We'll move on to our next item of the agenda, the RAC Annual Report Committee Update. Mike, is there anything that you would like to talk about?
I have a little bit of a list here of just give you an update of everything. I wish I could be there in person, but so thank you for bearing with me on the computer. So to let everyone know that all members are now cleared to begin speaking with riders and collecting info. Mahalia created a Google Doc that members of the committee can log their collected rider data if members choose to do that. They don't have to, but we've started just I think a few entries in there and keep doing that. But hopefully members of the committee just go ahead and keep talking to people, and that's what we're doing. And reached out to John and Bryna regarding WMATA data, and we'll follow up on, we can get some of that outreach information from Metro's data and that kind of stuff. And one interesting thing of the people that I've been speaking to on the trains, for some reason, one of the big issues people have had is a little surprising. It was smoking and marijuana and cigarettes in the stations and on the trains. That was the one thing that a lot of people were like, that is an issue. So just throwing that out there, just as just kind of showing some of the results that at least I'm getting on my end to show that this isn't going to be. This is actually people have dynamic, concerns and issues as they raise them to us. And regarding social media, I understand that the prevailing view is to look into building out the RAC website to help collect the solicited data instead of using social media and email like I kind of originally laid out. And I think something like that, if we're going to build out the website that affects the RAC as a whole, as opposed to just the annual report committee. But I did want to defer to Marcella to weigh in if she's there or not, but if she wants to weigh in on that regarding what she thinks is the best way to, as opposed to when, again, not the in-person stuff, but the electronic or the distance one, whether it's social media or whether it's building out a website where people can, be steered to where they log in and kind of, respond to the questions that we're asking. So it's something that hoping that she can respond to. And before that, the only last thing on my list is I want to work to get a list of the WMATA outreach events for the RAC to potentially jump into, so we can kind of collect some in-person data if there's already a pre-existing event, and we can just kind of show up, members of the committee, if it's easy for anybody to just start talking to people. And that's all I have, and that's kind of the update in where we're at, but we have begun reaching out to riders in earnest.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you very much for, again, shepherding this process for our annual report. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks.
Moving on to our next agenda item, are there any announcements or new business?
I just want to make sure that all of you and RAC members out on Teams, that you did get an email inviting you to the Silverline grand opening on Tuesday, November 15th. If you have questions, I will note, one, we invited a lot of people. We're looking forward to a great event. If you got an invitation and could please RSVP by the end of the day tomorrow so we can plan for you, that would be great. And then just one note is that unfortunately, there's not going to be transportation provided to and from Dulles. So if you have questions about how to get there, happy to help.
Thank you. Is there any other announcements or new business items? Hearing none, we'll move into our last agenda item, which is adjournment. I move that we adjourn this meeting of the Riders Advisory Council on November 9th, 2022. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you all so much, and I'll talk to you all soon.